Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Beach Walk blog number 9. So today I wanted to talk about the core and the pelvis, and I'm kind of lumping these two together because they really should be. And I want to firstly define what is the core. Now, for anybody who has not been on the Revolutionize Your Running, the Sling Method page for very long, you might be thinking the core, oh, that's your abdominals. Well, the abdominals are a part of the core, and they're an important part of the core. But the core, really, I define the core for a reason. I define it specifically in this way, as anything that attaches to the pelvis. So we know that obviously everything affects everything in the body. Everything affects everything. So there's many muscles and many structures, the fascial structures that connect to the pelvis and through the pelvis. And most of these muscles and structures that connect to the pelvis, I'll say most of them, all of them, will influence what the pelvis does and how it moves, how it functions, how it transfers force, and what forces travel through it. Now, we know that the torso affects the pelvis. We know that the pelvis affects the torso. And as we just said, any muscle or any structure that attaches to the pelvis can affect the pelvis. So that means the core muscles, the abdominals, the rectus abdominis, the obliques, the internal and external obliques, the transverse abdominis. Also, we've got to think about the adductors, the hamstrings. We've got to think about the quadratus lumborum muscles. We've got to think about the lats. We've got to think about the hip flexors, the glutes. These are all core muscles because they attach and influence the pelvis. Okay, so there's loads of muscles there that attach and influence the pelvis. Now, if they attach to the pelvis and influence the pelvis, then we must think about those muscles as a part of our global movement. So if those muscles attach to the pelvis and they influence the pelvis, and therefore they influence the movement of the pelvis and other things as well, they must play a very big role in what happens when we run and when we walk, right? So let's just talk about common running injuries. First one that I want to talk about is an obvious one, really. It's high hamstring tendinopathy or proximal hamstring tendinopathy. Now, I hear this a lot in running groups. I hear this a lot from people who are suffering with high hamstring tendinopathy, that it just lasts forever and they can't get rid of it. They can't seem to get improvement. And the thing is that when we have when we have a tendon issue, we've got to think of the muscle that's attaching to that tendon and think about what that muscle does, what role it plays in attaching to that tendon, and how it influences that tendon. All right, so we've got to talk about the muscles of the core and how they're influencing the pelvis, and therefore how they're influencing how they're influencing other things. So we've got to think about what those muscles have to do in order to play a role in what's occurring with that tendon. So if we think about the core and we think about how it attaches to the pelvis, if your pelvis is tipped forwards and it's in that position all the time, that's going to place a lot of stress and a lot of strain onto the proximal hamstring tendon. Now, we need muscles to work together in order to share load and allow opposite muscles to relax when it's their turn to relax in movement, because remember, movement is reciprocated in opposites. So once a muscle is contracted, it should then relax, especially in a movement like gait where we have flexion, extension, internal rotation, external rotation. We get those movements occurring one after the other. We have extension, then we have flexion. So when we have extension in a joint, so for example in the hip joint, your hamstring tendon is going to be working with the muscle, and then when we get flexion occurring, that hamstring tendon should be able to relax because the muscle is able to relax. So that takes the strain off the tendon, and that should happen momentarily. But when we have a situation with the pelvis where the pelvis is tipped forwards in that anterior pelvic tilt situation, the proximal hamstring tendon never gets a chance to relax because it's never allowed to. Because if the pelvis is tipped forwards, it's constantly pulling onto the tendon and onto the hamstring, because that's all it's got, that's all it can do. Now we're going to go back to the core again. Part of your core muscle's role is to influence the pelvis in 3 ways. So we have a tilting forwards and a tilting backwards. We have a movement in this plane, the frontal plane, where we have elevation and depression, and then we have the movement in the transverse plane where it rotates. Okay? Now each one of those movements is an opposite. So if we have this happening, we should have this happening. If we have this happening, we then should have this happening. If we have this happening, we should then have this happening. And we should be able to get in and out of those positions. We should have access to both movements. Now if we don't have access to both movements, what that means is that we're getting continuous strain on a tendon or on a body part, whether that's a tendon or whether it's an attachment point. In this case, we're talking about the proximal hamstring tendon, and how if your pelvis is tipped forwards, it's going to pull on that tendon, it's going to pull on the hamstrings, and it's going to make that tendon long, it's going to make it excited, it's going to make it stressed. So if it's making it long and stressed and stretched, and it never gets a chance to relax, and we know that tendons tend to degrade when they're under too much load for too long a period of time, that's one of the causes, or it would be one of the causes, of a proximal hamstring tendinopathy. Okay, so that's the first one. So how does the core play a part in that? Well, we know that a lot of people tend to have this anterior pelvic tilt situation, and we see a lot of runners with quote unquote weak calves, or what we'd hear is, oh, my calves are tight. Well, they're probably not tight, they're probably being stressed and being pulled on, because if you've got an anterior pelvic tilt, then you're going to be stressing the hamstrings all the time. If you're stressing the hamstrings all the time, you're going to be stressing the calves all the time. And if you're stressing the calves all the time, you're going to be stressing the Achilles tendon all the time. So we see things like Achilles tendonitis, Achilles tendinosis, Achilles tendinopathy. We see all these different things. So how does the core play a part in that? Well, if the core is not functioning in a reciprocating manner, i.e. we can't get in and out of certain positions, and we're always being held in one position, then we're always loading the same tendon all the time. It just doesn't get a chance to relax. So the key is to not try and strengthen that muscle even more. The key is to take the strain away from that muscle, because that muscle is working all the time. It's constantly working, it's switched on and working all the time, and therefore so is its tendon. Right? If I was to grab hold of your arm and start pulling on your arm and just literally pull on your arm 24/7, your arm would get tired, even though it's not actually technically doing much. it is doing something. It's doing a hell of a lot of work because I'm pulling on it the whole time. And that's the same thing as what's happening to your hamstring and the hamstring tendon. Okay? Now the similar kind of thing applies to the Achilles tendon. So all of this plays into the role of the core. Because if the core muscles are working together, then we won't end up with that fixed situation with the pelvis. So the core is really playing a massive role in the situation of the pelvis. Not the location of it, but the situation of it in its location. So whether it's tilted forwards or whether it's able to be pulled into neutral, its movement ability is determined by all of those muscles around the core. All right. Now, one of the main muscles that I wanted to talk about is the TFL, the tensor fasciae lata, and that is also a hip flexor and an internal rotator. Now, it's a single joint muscle in that it initiates at the pelvis, at the front of the pelvis, and it attaches onto the femur. It's a single joint muscle. Now, if you're spending your life sitting down, or most of your life sitting down, that TFL is going to adaptively shorten and it's going to get tight. Now, that truly is a tightness. It's not like I've got tight calves and tight hamstrings. That's a taut situation, like we just discussed. No, this is a situation of actual tightness because the TFL is shortening or being shortened in a shortened state all the time, and it's not being released, it's not being allowed to lengthen, because you might spend 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day sitting down and then you might get on a bike, let's say, and then you might do a ton of squats. Now, none of these things are helping that TFL to lengthen. None of them are allowing your pelvis to get out of that anterior tilted position. All right. So the first thing that you want to do as somebody who's got a high hamstring tendinopathy is work on those TFLs and also the glute medius, because the glute medius is also the anterior fibers of the glute medius are an internal rotation, have an internal rotation action to them. So we want to work on both of those. We want to release the TFL and we want to release the glute medius to allow that pelvis to get out of an anterior pelvic tilt and then take the strain away from the hamstrings and the calves and the Achilles and so on, so on. Now, that TFL is also really important for the next structure that I wanted to talk about, which is the IT band. So the IT band attaches down past the knee onto the tibia, and it runs all the way down the outside of your leg, and you cannot affect it by foam rolling it or stretching it. You can't stretch it. It's just impossible to stretch. In fact, I think I remember a piece of research saying that the tensile strength of the IT band was something like 2,000 pounds per square inch. That might even be more than that. Essentially, you could pull a jumbo jet with your IT band and it wouldn't change its length. It's incredibly strong. Same as the plantar fascia, incredibly strong. Same as the Achilles tendon, incredibly strong, because these are the spring structures that are within our body. So if it's that strong and it's made to withstand thousands of pounds of force, you're not going to affect it, you're not going to change its length by foam rolling it or resting on a ball or whatever, or trying to stretch it. You can't do that. So we'll get to why you will foam roll that area, or why you will MFR that area in just a moment. But the TFL attaches into, or should I say it becomes, the IT band in its distal attachment. It comes away from the pelvis, it goes down, and it becomes the IT band, and the IT band goes down and attaches or becomes the tibia. Now, if your TFL is tight shortened, because remember we have tight short and we have taut long. Taut means already stretched, so you've pulled something taut, like a rope. A rope isn't tight, it's pulled taut. Okay, got to understand the difference between those two. It's really important. It's tight short and it's taut long. Okay, so if you pull on a piece of elastic, you pull it taut. You don't pull it tight, you pull it taut. Okay, now with your TFL, if your TFL is shortened and tight, it's going to pull on the structure below it taut. Now, what we just said before about a muscle that is constantly being contracted or constantly being asked to work, what's that going to do to its associated tendon? It's going to keep it pulled taut the whole time. Okay? It's going to keep it pulled taut the whole time. Now, if it's keeping it pulled taut the whole time, whoa, I'm going to get swept away. If it's keeping it pulled taut the whole time and it doesn't get a chance to rest, then it's going to get really angry. It's going to get really angry. So now, if we think about the structures around the core, like I just said, remember the definition of the core is anything that attaches to your pelvis. So we've got the glute medius, the glute max, we've got the TFL. They all attach and become the IT band, and your IT band attaches below the knee. So if your IT band attaches below the knee and we've got an anterior pelvic tilt, then what we've got is we've got a tight TFL, we've got a tight glute medius, the anterior fibers, and we've got a taut glute max. Dun dun dun. Okay, so if we've now got and we've also got taut hamstrings and probably some taut adductors as well. See how it knocks on? And we've got taut rectus abdominis and taut external obliques. Right? See how it all continues on biomechanically. It all continues on and on. So, if you've got IT band syndrome, then you've probably got a tight TFL. You've probably got a tight glute medius anterior fibers and a taut glute max, and you'll want to release those TFLs, glute medius, to allow the pelvis to tilt back to neutral, and then that will gradually take the strain off the IT band. You're going to have to do some kind of work on your abdominals and your obliques. So just doing the movement that we want to get into. So posteriorly tilting the pelvis. So if your pelvis is tipped forwards like this, then what we want to do is to work the muscles that are doing the right job in the right place at the right time. We want to start tilting your pelvis backwards. Okay, we want to tilt it backwards. And that will get all the muscles that hold it in that position to do their job, which will then take the strain off the proximal hamstring tendon. It will take the strain off the Achilles, the strain off the calves, the strain off the hamstrings, and it will take the strain off the IT band, because we're going to release the TFL on the glute medius and the glute max. See how it all ties in? Okay, so how does the core play a role in all of this? Well, because the core is not just one thing, it's a multitude of things. It's how the pelvis tilts forwards and backwards, how it elevates and depresses side to side, and how it rotates. So if it's all of those things, and we've just really been talking about the anterior and posterior tilt actions, and then on the last one where we were talking about the IT band, that might be the lateral depression and elevation. if you're outside, your lateral quads are also overworked, really strong, then what you've probably done there is you've developed some kind of maybe some kind of fascial thickening, because remember, fascia thickens where we work muscles. Fascia thickens because it adapts to the stresses and strains that are placed upon it. So if we're using these muscles lots and lots, the fascia is going to thicken because that's what it should do. It's adapting to the stress. So it's saying, oh, you use me loads. Oh, I better get stronger. Stronger in the terms of fascia means thickening, right? So we might have a situation where a cyclist who uses their vastus lateralis muscles really uses them a lot. And what the fascia will do is it will thicken, and that fascia from the vastus lateralis muscle, which is on the outside of your leg, that will attach, and does attach, to the IT band. So if we've got fascial thickening around the vastus lateralis, then we're going to have increased stress and strain onto the IT band. If we've got increased stress and strain indirectly on the IT band, that will pull onto the IT band attachment. So, should we foam roll the IT band? Yes. Are we trying to affect the IT band? No. Can we affect the vastus lateralis and the associated thin fascia around that area? Yes. Are we trying to affect the IT band? No. It has nothing to do with the IT band, but the effect, the after effect, it's the knock-on effect. If I MFR the lateralis and the associated fascia in that area, just by a knock-on effect, I affect the IT band. Okay, so I'm not foam rolling my IT band. I'm foam rolling, or I'm MFRing my lateralis and all of the fascia in that area. I'm not trying to MFR or foam roll my IT band. I have no choice. I will be MFRing and foam rolling my IT band because I have no choice. If I'm going to MFR and foam roll the lateralis, I will hit the IT band. But I'm not trying to affect the IT band. I'm trying, and I am affecting the other structures around it. And that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, so I don't care if you go in and you foam roll your IT band. It's irrelevant. What's relevant is why and what you're actually doing. All right, so don't for a second think that you're actually affecting the IT band, the structure of it, the length of it, its tensile properties. You're not affecting those things. You're not going to. Even if you wanted to, you're not going to. Okay, you're not going to, even if you wanted to. But what you are doing is affecting every single structure around it. Okay, so when I say yes, foam roll the IT band, what I'm saying is foam roll the IT band area, the location, where it is, where it's situated, because if you don't foam roll that area or MFR that area, you're going to miss all of the good stuff. But again, I'm going to repeat, you cannot affect the IT band by MFRing, foam rolling that area. Now, if you can't affect it, you can't have any effect on it, positive or negative. So it doesn't matter, okay? You cannot affect it, so you cannot affect it positively or negatively. So when people say, oh no, you can't foam roll your IT band, you can foam roll your IT band, you just can't affect it. Do you understand the difference between that? You can do it, but you can't affect it by doing it. There's a big difference, okay? So if we've got this fascial thickening in the areas that surround the IT band, and let's say there's some trigger points in the actual lateralis muscle, the vastus lateralis, if you don't foam roll or MFR that area, you're going to miss out on all the good stuff that goes with foam rolling, MFRing that area, okay? So yes, do foam roll, do MFR that area, absolutely do, because you can't affect anything negatively even if you wanted to, okay? Very, very important, that. Okay, so we're back to the core. So your core's role, like we said before, is to control and influence the pelvis, to drive force through the pelvis via the fascial lines, the kinetic chains, let's call them that, the chains that we need to affect. Okay, so as I contract one muscle, what it does is it pulls on the rest of the fascial line to then contract those muscles in sequence. Alright, so the pelvis has those three movements and any combination of those three movements. So forward and backward tilt, lateral depression and elevation, and then rotation. Okay. Now, the core muscles, like we said before, anything that attaches to the pelvis. Now we know that we cannot move unless we're rotating. Every movement that we make involves rotation. It all involves rotation. Okay, you must understand that from a movement perspective, every single movement involves rotation. So you can't move without rotating. Okay, so you might have heard, you might have been in this situation where somebody says to you, "You have a rotated pelvis." Yeah, I'm absolutely sure you do have a rotated pelvis. The question is, why? And can you unrotate it? So we just said that the pelvis has three movements and any combination of those three movements. If you have a rotated pelvis, what that's saying is you have a situation where you are stuck. You're stuck in an off neutral position. Okay, so you're stuck in a situation where your pelvis doesn't neutralize itself. What that means is that you have some tightness somewhere that's stopping your pelvis from coming back to some kind of neutral. Whatever that is, it's just causing a load to be transferred through the pelvis to somewhere else, which is stopping it from being in a neutral position. So how do we affect that? How do we change that? Well, first thing we have to do is we have to identify which direction your pelvis is rotated in. Now, from previous beach walk blogs, we've talked about how the torso, the ribs, the spine and the pelvis are all integrated. And we know that when the pelvis rotates, when the torso rotates one way, the pelvis rotates the opposite way, or it should, every single time. So I'm walking right now, and when my torso rotates clockwise, my pelvis should rotate anti-clockwise, counterclockwise, and vice versa. Now, if I'm stuck in a situation where I have a rotated pelvis, that's telling me that I am not able to either counter-rotate the pelvis or rotate the torso, or a combination of the two. So what I must do is figure out which way my pelvis is rotated, if it is rotated, look at any habitual situations that I put myself into where I'm playing into that movement pattern or playing into that habitual situation, and then change them. Because remember, go back to Beach Walk Blog 1, we don't get out of the injury cycle until we make a change. So we must make a change to get a change. So if I'm going to change how my pelvis is situated, I must change the situation of my pelvis, right? So that's a pretty simple one. I got to look at the habits and the habitual situations I put myself and my pelvis and my torso into and change them. So maybe I sit on the sofa and I sit crooked, and I do that every single night, 7 days a week. And I never do it the other way, or I never train myself to do something in the other direction. And that puts me into a shortened situation through one side of my body, which then creates a torque, a twisted action in my body. It could be that simple. It could be that you carried a bag on one shoulder every day for however long every day when you were a kid, and that has stuck with you over the years. It could be that you're a golfer and you hit 500 golf balls a week all in the same direction, and you never do anything to go back the other way. And you've been doing that every week for the last 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. It could be that you play tennis, and when you play tennis you favor your forehand, and if you're right-handed you'll be swinging the racket from here to here, and you do that 1,000 times every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday when you play tennis, but you only hit 25 backhand shots. Okay, so these things they're coming from somewhere. Remember, fascia adapts to the stresses and strains that we place upon it, which means that when we move in a certain way, we adapt to those movements. We get functional adaptation. That's one of the principles of training. So if we're getting functional adaptation, that means that we're getting a training effect. Now the training effect will occur whether you want it to or not. It's just a fundamental principle of the body and how it adapts. You can't stop it, you can't change it. It's just a fundamental principle. And that's what happens with habitual situations or habitual movements or sporting movements, where you're getting yourself into these situations where you're dominating one pattern or one plane of motion or one movement pattern, and then we get that functional adaptation and we get a long-term effect, which is a rotated pelvis. Okay, so those are quite big ones. It might be just a habitual situation, the way you sit at your desk, the way you sit on your sofa, the way you hold your phone to your ear and you crook your neck and you lift your shoulder up to your ear to hold your phone steady to your ear. Okay, these are all things that you can change, and you can then change over time, because it takes time. It took time in the first place, it takes time now to get rid of it or to move away from that situation. Okay, so we talked about the pelvis, we talked a little about the core, we talked about some common injuries from runners and some common issues. Now we're going to talk about how to train your core. Well, you know this because if you've been tuning into my Beach Walk blogs, you absolutely know that strength and power are specific to the movement. And we've just talked about the movements of the pelvis and the movements of the torso. So if your strength training must mimic the movements that you want to be better at, then training your core muscles is really, really easy, because all you got to do is do the movements that those joints should be doing. So the main one, and I go back to what I just said just a few minutes ago, every single movement is a rotational movement. Okay, the body is made up of levers, lever systems, and these levers work together to functionally produce rotational movements. So you must be rotating, you don't have a choice. So therefore, you absolutely must train rotational movements. Okay? You absolutely must train rotational movements. So train rotational movements. And it is that simple, okay? Not anti-rotation. Anti-rotation is barbaric and it's ridiculous. All right, I'm being brutally honest here. It is ridiculous. There is no movement that involves anti-rotation if all movement is rotation. Okay? You can't learn to rotate and produce better rotational movement by anti-rotating, by not rotating. That is the biggest oxymoron ever. Rotational movement is movement. So again, like that in itself is an oxymoron. Rotational movement, oh well, but it is rotational. Movement is rotational. So the phrase rotational movement is an oxymoron. Right? You can't move without rotating, so rotational movement is redundant because it is rotation. Movement is rotation, right? So work on the rotational capacity of your body. Remember we talked in Beach Walk Blog 6, I think it was, about the foot, or 7 about the foot. The foot rotates, it has to. The ankle rotates, it has to. And previously to that we talked about the hip, and then we talked about the knee. The knee has to rotate, it all has to rotate. So do rotate, because that way what you're doing is you're integrating every single muscle in your body, because that's how it works. There is no isolated movements. You're integrating all of those movements into your training and your strength training. You're strengthening the rotational capacity of your body. Now, when you get better at dealing with rotational movement, you get better at dealing with torque, because torque is rotation. It's rotational force, so it's force around a pivot point, around an axis, around a pivot point, and that is how we move. Okay, so everything in the sling method is standing up. Everything in the sling method involves your core because it's standing up. Everything in the sling method involves every muscle in your core because you're standing up, and you are moving in a rotated fashion. You are producing rotational movement, and you're doing that rotational movement in the way that we move when we run, which is why it's so effective. Like I said, there is no isolated movement. There is nothing that just involves one muscle. You can't isolate muscles. Oh, but I can do bicep curls. Yeah, you can't do bicep curls laying down. And even if you could, still using your forearm flexors, and you're still using your shoulder muscles to do it. Even if you laid down with a cable or a resistance band, you're still using your forearm flexors. So bicep curls are not just using your biceps. They're using the shoulder, they're using the scapular stabilizers, they're using the spinal stabilizers, and even on the ground you'll still be using all those muscles. So no, there is no isolated movement ever. Okay? Fundamental. So we talked about the core. Anything that involves or anything that attaches or influences the pelvis. The last thing I want to talk about is the psoas. I want you to forget the psoas even exists. Forget the psoas even exists. Imagine nobody had ever said the word psoas. Because the reality of it is that if you think you have a tight psoas, you probably don't. And if you think you can stretch the psoas, you can't. And if you think that you're going to stretch a tight psoas, you won't. Because the psoas is kind of like a last bastion of support. It's the reason why you're feeling something in your psoas. And there's lots of quote-unquote abdominal exercises that you might have done in the past that are actually psoas exercises. They're working your psoas. Laying down, extending the legs in front of you or away from you. Those are real hip flexor exercises. They're not abdominal exercises, just by nature. Anyway, I digress. You can't really change what's going on at the psoas without changing everything around it. So the psoas attaches to, I think it's L1 to L4 vertebrae. It passes through the pelvis and attaches to the posterior aspect of the femur. Now, when you sit down a lot, that might get functionally shortened, but that doesn't mean that you need to stretch it, because what happens to that muscle, you have to kind of imagine this in three-dimensional space. If it's attaching to the inside of your spine, or to the inside lateral aspect of the spine, of the facet joints, and it's attaching to the inside medial posterior aspect of your femur, what it's going to do is, if it's functionally shortened, it's actually going to turn your leg outwards. It's going to make you walk like a duck. It's going to cause those feet to point outwards, and you can do all the squats in the world, it's not going to make any difference, because it doesn't work that way, unfortunately. And I see this a lot with CrossFitters. They do millions and millions and millions of squats, and they still have the same issues. In fact, they have them worse, because they're now strengthening those positions and functionally shortening certain things even more and making it functionally worse. So I just want you to forget the psoas. You're not going to be able to get to it really very well. You might be able to get a ball in there. And I'm talking about on the leg, not on the spine. But it's just not worth it. Now, if you go through the checklist and you start using that checklist, and the part of that checklist that's really important, there's 3 parts to it. It's all really important, but for today, talking now about the psoas, if you are internally rotating the back leg and you are neutralizing the pelvis into a posterior action, and you are stacking your head on top of your shoulders and your shoulders on top of your pelvis, i.e. you're vertically stacking your body, you are going to lengthen your psoas in a really specific way. Because when you push the ground away and you internally rotate the hips and you stack the body in that way, you're contracting all of the opposing muscles. You're actively putting that muscle into a state of length, and you are demanding, 1, by the position that you're getting into, and 2, by the muscles that you're contracting, you're demanding that other muscle, the psoas, lengthen and let go. So if you're demanding in 2 ways, by putting it into a lengthened state, forcing the opposing muscles to contract, you're going to get that psoas to lengthen, and that's all you need to do. You're actively lengthening it, you're actively forcing it by what's called reciprocal inhibition. When you contract one muscle, its functional opposites must relax and allow that movement to occur. So if we look at my elbow, I think you can see that. So if I contract my biceps and all of the other muscles that are associated with elbow flexion, anything that opposes that must relax. Now, if I do that, when I extend my elbow flexors must relax to allow the extensors to extend the elbow. Okay, that's called reciprocal inhibition. And that occurs every time you move. Every time you move, there's a reciprocal inhibition occurring. Okay? And that's to do with the inverse myotatic reflexes, etc., etc. So you don't need to know about that for this. And when that occurs, what we do is, if we're taking a joint to pretty much to its end range of motion, and then forcing, and that's what we do with the checklist, we're taking things to their end range of motion in certain cases, i.e. the leg that's behind you, the hip is in extension, internal rotation, and then you're stacking your body in a vertical nature. That's taking things to almost to an end range of motion. And what we're doing then is we're contracting the muscles that take it to end range of motion to force the muscles that resist that to relax. Okay? It's a little bit more complicated than that, and it's a little bit more dynamic with the pelvis, because the pelvis is very much more dynamic than my elbow. But the mechanism is the same. And that's really important. The mechanism is the same, and when we put that pelvis into that position and we demand a contraction from the opposing muscle groups, then we're telling that psoas, you must lengthen. If anywhere you are tight, you must lengthen. And remember, we pretty much not going to be able to MFR your psoas. You're just not going to get to it. It's pretty much impossible. You think you're getting to it, but you're not. Okay? So forget about your psoas. Just let it, use the checklist, and it'll fix those things. Those things all kind of come out in the wash. You don't need to say, oh, I'm gonna MFR and stretch my psoas. No, you don't need to worry about it. Just forget that even exists. It's there, it does a job, and it's probably, you know, certain parts of it are probably functionally shortened and tight, and other parts are probably taut, long, blah 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 blah. But you don't need to worry about it, because you can't do anything about it actively, specifically to it. You have to affect everything else to allow the stress that's being placed on the psoas as a last resort because of your pelvis position. You have to do all the other things to affect it. Okay, so there we go. That is all about your core. Oh yeah, last thing, forget planks. All right, because remember, they're anti-rotation. They're not doing the role of the core muscles dynamically, and you are stiffening your body into one position, which actively stops it from moving in and out of the position that we want. Okay, so just forget planks. They are the worst exercise ever. They do not, in fact, I might just do a whole beach walk vlog about planks and how wrong they are, how silly they are. That might be a good idea. So let's not talk about that now. Just don't do them. There's so many better things that you can do. So many better things that you can do. All right. And there we go. That is your beach walk vlog for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're getting something out of these beach walk vlogs, because I'm enjoying them. I love them. I will talk to you all soon. Take care. Have a fabulous day. Bye.